Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much for coming to our panel this evening. My name is Professor Jeffrey Thompson. I'm in the Art and Art History Department, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming, whether it's out of your own academic background, your general curiosity, or a specific concern over the destruction of antiquities by the Islamic State. My thanks go first and foremost to our panelists this afternoon. They responded quickly and graciously to my invitation to participate in this discussion of modern iconoclasm, and they agreed without hesitation to share their expertise and perspective on the shocking events in Palmyra. I simply acted really spontaneously after reading a couple of news articles to reach out to colleagues here at Swanee for answers and comment. Perhaps evident in the incorrect venue printed on the poster, we were in haste so that these current events could remain as they are current, as opposed to the recent past. My reaction, perfectly manipulated in some ways by the Islamic State and the media who feed the beast, so to speak, and perhaps that can be part and parcel of our Q&A this afternoon. And it's my hope we can address some of the paradoxes in having a panel on this topic. But without further ado, let me introduce our panelists today. To my immediate left is Dr. Sarah Nemes, who is the Mellon Globalization Forum Fellow. Next to her, Dr. Jacqueline DiBiase-Salmons in Classical Archeology. Next to Dr. Salmons, Dr. Chris McDonough in Classical Languages, a rather obscure figure on our campus, so I hope we get to know him better today. And to my far left, Dr. Nicholas Roberts in history, specializing in Islamicism and the Middle East. In recent days, ISIS has committed two atrocities in the Syrian city of Palmyra. First, as many of you I'm sure know, they beheaded Khalid al-Assad, the 82-year-old retired chief archaeologist of the city, before mutilating his body. And then they blew up the ancient temple of Baal-Shemin, built in AD 17. And it might also seem repugnant that, judging by press and social media reaction, many of us find the destruction of a stone building at least as shocking as the decapitation of a human being. We know that people matter much more than things, and yet it seems we can be more moved by cultural vandalism than cold-blooded murder at times. Caring about humanity, however, is more than simply wanting as many people to live as possible. What matters is not just how many people live, but how they live as well. If I had to choose, I'm sure if any of us had to choose, we would pull a person from a burning building before a great work of art. But it does not mean that to care about the destruction of our heritage is to care about things more than we do people. Rather, as Julian Baggini recently stated in the Guardian newspaper in Britain, it is to care about people as more than just biological things. So on that note, I'd like to open our panel. And really the first question is a foundational one. Why Palmyra? Its location, its history, and its significance. And this is really, I think, a question about history and the built architecture of Palmyra and its antiquities. To the panel.
Okay.
It's a very gracious panel.
Just for those of you that are unfamiliar with the site, so Palmyra was a site in Syria. It's in central Syria. It was a site from the 2nd century BC, but it gained its prosperity when it became part of the Roman Roman site of Syria. And through that period, it flourished. And most of the buildings that were recently destroyed are from that period of Roman rule. Palmyra was a site in the crossroads. It was in a key location because it was at the crossroads for caravan traders. And so all things moving east went near Palmyra, and it became very rich for that reason. It was a city of many civilizations. So I mentioned that the Romans were there. A lot of native Semitic groups also had influence in Palmyra, and also the Greeks. So it was at a crossroads geographically, and also with all the diverse people that lived there.
And that's right. I mean, I think that probably the most famous person that's associated with Palmyra is Queen Zenobia. Were you going to mention Zenobia? I know Queen Zenobia was the great 3rd century leader of Palmyra. One of the most magnificent women of antiquity, really. She derived her heritage, she claims, from Dido and Cleopatra, and she's to be compared to both, the one legendary, the other one historical. Conquers Syria, Egypt, Arabia, before ultimately being confronted by Emperor Aurelian, who's probably one of the only memorable Roman emperors of the 3rd century, and then conquered, brought to Rome, and led in triumph in chains, and then eventually spared, and then lives in Italy, and has all these family members who are, who continue to exist. We have all these people who are named Zenobias, like the great Florentine saints. So a remarkable figure. Whose operas are written about her, famous paintings, a number of statues. And this is just one figure. I mean, if we care about Palmyra at all, I think it's because of the sort of incredible heritage that it has. But if we had to, pick one figure that represents Palmyra, I would think it's Zenobia. And I think that she's really famous among Syrians as well, as sort of representing Syrian nationhood or something like that.
Yeah, I was actually just reading something about that. Local Syrians, certainly the Palmyrians, if you want to say that, they sort of said they were the people of Zenobia. A lot locally, that's one of the ways that they sort of refer to themselves. I wanted to take it up more to the modern day a little bit. The site, obviously, the Romans sacked it, and then it was sort of turned into more like a village. I think at the time of Zenobia, it was 200,000 people living in the area. So that's a pretty massive city for the time. At least that's what I've read. And but it became a village after that. But under the Arabs, it certainly was a trading post. It remained as a sort of part of the crossroads. Obviously it was ancient Silk Road, but after that, there were other trading sites, along this route, and Palmyra was very important. Under the Ottomans, there was a bit of a revival, but really it became a great archaeological site under the French, when the French had their mandate there. And actually, one of the things that the French did, and this is obviously why we end up with a sort of World Heritage Site, is in the 1920s, one of their chief archaeologists sort of persuaded the local people who were actually living amongst the ruins. I mean, parts of the village were in the ruins, and you have Gertrude Bell sort of writing in her accounts about people still living in, the colonnades and things like this. So the French actually persuaded them in the 1920s to move out, and there was a purpose-built village of Tadmor, which is only something like 500 meters away from the site, that was built. And during the French period and later on into the Syrian period, this really was a base for archaeologists and tourists. It was built up in the tourist trade. It also is a site of a big prison where the Syrian dictatorship of Assad certainly had a lot of political prisoners. I don't think that's the reason why ISIS came there. It's clearly for the antiquities. And we can talk about that as we go on.
Well, from the archaeological perspective, I think that one of the questions, at least in my mind, is why should we care about this destruction? What is it about that trade in antiquities, the Islamic State funding their revolution through antiquities? How might we better understand those details?
I am the archaeologist, so I guess I'll take this up, defend myself. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about this question recently and self-reflecting on archaeology and as a profession and why all of you guys are here probably today. Why do we care? And I think that archaeology allows us to see ourselves in human continuity and to see our place in the world. So archaeology is really the story of us. And no one, unfortunately, knows that better than ISIS, who has used the past kind of against it. And in reflecting, I think that when one studies the past, we try to tease out a lot of different cultures. But what comes out most of all is our sameness. So I study Latin graffiti, and one thing I'm always, I continue to be surprised at is when I see Marcus is here and how similar that is to us. So to see the place in the world and the human continuity. And I think that that idea of sameness is probably very unnerving to extremists like ISIS. So that's my archaeology, why it matters.
I'd like to make a comment on this idea of sameness, because one thing that's very interesting, sort of a contrast to this definition of sameness that you're giving in terms of us as a common human sameness, is that for these militants, they have this idea of tawhid, and actually the gesture that they make is this, they put up their finger as one, which means the unity of God, the unity of truth, and which of course is their truth to them, right? And so the destruction of these kinds of sites, I think for them, is the destruction of ethnic nationalism, which they see as something that's dividing what they call the Ummah, which is the Islamic nation, which from their perspective, it should be this unified nation under one truth, one government, and one right, sort of divinely ordained leadership.
It's interesting. I mean, I just want to pick up on that because, I mean, it's interesting. The archaeology, points out continuities with the past, but the discontinuities are also interesting and tell us something about ourselves. I mean, Palmyra is a place of tremendous religious pluralism. I mean, the Temple of Belshaman, is this kind of syncretic, it incorporates Syrian as well as Roman elements, and I'm right that that's sort of unique in the record, and in this tremendous state of preservation until it was purposely destroyed. And it's hard not to think of that as being a cultural commentary. That particular building, well known, in Syrian circles, should be the very one that is got the mushroom cloud over it.
One of the reactions I sort of had was when Jeff asked me about this was actually I had a sort of opposite reaction. I would say that the destruction of the temples affected me, but certainly there's been a lot more killing going on, which you pointed to, and it's something we all discussed before we went to this panel. We were all discussing, in a sense, is it right to have such a sort of a panel when we are talking about, certainly images that have come out now recently with the young Kurdish boy, that have really had a huge effect and impact actually on European politics now. I mean, so this is something we've wrestled with just talking about this for the panel. This sort of notion of kind of this sort of world heritage that's being destroyed by a particularist group, it's sort of an interesting concept, but there's also individuals losing their lives. So we haven't quite wrestled with the implications of all that.
Yeah, but over a beer last Thursday, I think it became quite clear that the points that perhaps divide us along those lines aren't as great as those that bring us together. And so one of the things I hope you guys will talk about, and perhaps Sarah, you're about to, is the way in which responding to ISIS's manipulation of Western media, choosing Palmyra because we in the West like it. We've marked it as a World Heritage Site, and it becomes a target for that reason.
That's a very interesting question, but I wanted to make one comment on Nick's comments before we move on to that, which is the example of that photograph of this drowned child is a very interesting one, because we all heard the figures, we heard the news about it, but there's something about an image that touches us, that moves people in a way that the abstraction can't move us. And I think there is something about these ancient sites that they they remind us of the fact that there are so many generations of people who've been here before us, maybe the cosmopolitanism of cultures that have existed before, many people who've passed through this land, different kinds of symbols that touch us now as they touched us then. There's so many different meanings that we ascribe to those sites, and that it's certainly, ISIS is certainly using that symbolic power and as Jeff has said, manipulating it to its own advantage.
You know, it's interesting too, because of course part of the reason that they're blowing those buildings up and putting them, and this has been a move among archaeologists not to publicize those images. You know, let's not show the image of the mushroom cloud, you know, because in that way we end. Yeah, that's the reason we didn't put it on our poster. Is that, you know, this is precisely part what ISIS wants, and I mean, I'm afraid that the reason they want to do that is not just ideological, but also they have this very mercantile interest in that. I mean, National Geographic last year reported that in just one area of Syria alone, ISIS have been able to raise $36 million out of the sale of antiquities. And you can really understand, I mean, that's just plain old marketing, right? We blow this building up, and now all of a sudden the value of the antiquities is that much greater because, well, you know, there's fewer of them, and now it's got this interesting story, and they know what they're doing.
And another part of that is by blowing up the buildings or the tombs wherever they got the antiquities, they can't be traced back to that location. So when they are sold and eventually find a home, that person won't have as much legal ramifications if they can't figure out where it came from.
You know, and I don't know. I don't know if you really if we want to talk about this, but the question that's raised is, you know, well, what's the right response for the West? You know, there was a piece by Gary Vican in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. He's the former director of the Walters Art Gallery, and some of you may have seen this. But you know, of course, one of his points was he said, "Look, this is a terrible situation, but perhaps it's necessary for museums to start buying those antiquities." Because they're being sold, and if they start going onto the private market, we're never going to see them ever again. They're just going to disappear. So given the fact that we don't have any good options, is the right thing to do. Now, of course, the counter argument would be, well, if we don't buy them at all, then they won't be sold. But $36 million didn't appear out of nowhere. So should museums start just buying these pieces, understanding that they're, in fact, encouraging this market, but at least they can be preserved, and Vican says, and then returned and repatriated when the time comes.
The British Museum just announced that they're holding a looted Syrian artifact, and they won't say which one it is, and they're holding it until Syria is again safe. And I think this is going to bring in a big debate of the Elgin marbles. Should foreign museums hold things to keep them safe? And at what point do they judge it safe? Will it be repatriated? Is it going to be safe again? So I think in the coming weeks we're going to see a big debate about museums safeguarding antiquities.
We should repeat the question.
Sure. I mean, are you prepared for questions from the audience?
Answer that question, and then
Sure.
The question though is.
I think do you need me to repeat?
Yeah, go ahead and repeat.
I was just asking in this construct of European museums holding artifacts until it's safe again. I'm asking safe for whom? It's the same thing that strikes me when you're talking about an archaeological community upset about Palmyra when it's blown up. Well, when the prison is built there, Palmyra is ruined for a lot of people. When there's mass executions in it, it's ruined for a lot of people. So at what point, safe for whom? Palmyra has long been an unsafe space for people in Syria.
I agree. I mean, I agree. Obviously, coming from Middle Eastern studies, rather than sort of thinking about the archaeology of this, certainly this is something. The deaths. It's been in the news all the time, and so this is something that we've concentrated on a lot more. And it's sort of interesting. Until the image of the sort of Kurdish boy on Until that time, it was sort of interesting to me, at least, and certainly there was a lot of commentary about it, that people in the West cared more when sort of these archaeological sites were destroyed. So I don't know why that is. I've got some suppositions, but this is something of interest. I think that's kind of what your question is getting to. And I don't know if I have a complete answer for that, and it does get into all the issues of Elgin marbles and all this sort of stuff. And certainly in Middle Eastern studies, we're acutely aware of things like Napoleon going into Egypt and starting Egyptology, which was also an act, as Said talks about in Orientalism, of sort of cultural imperialism, appropriation. So that's something we definitely talk about a lot. Of course, here there's quite a lot of destruction going on, so it's a different level of, it's just not going to exist anymore. So I think there might be a slight difference.
I mean, I think one way to think about this is to just pan out a little bit, and I mean, because we know that all of the resources and wealth and wonderful things in any community are safer when the people there are safe. And so if we have a genuine interest in not appropriating these things, but in protecting them for future generations of human beings, including Syrians and people from the region, that we should be very serious about protecting those communities, because in the end, they're the ones who will be able to protect those resources, and also the human resources, and the ecological resources and the other things that are devastated by warfare that do belong to us as a human race.
I mean, I think it's certainly interesting that it is sort of shining a light on how much, and this is something we've talked about a little bit, how along with sort of acts that might be considered genocidal or sort of massacres, there's also a sort of cultural genocide that is going on. We were sort of, at least there's sort of an erasure, at least by ISIS, of sort of history and of culture, and an attempt to make a sort of pure state that's quite outside a lot of the Islamic traditions. I mean, we have to sort of ask, first of all, if this has been a state, a place, a city under Muslim control for centuries, why is it now that it's being destroyed? ISIS obviously is claiming we're doing this because we are acting in the the Prophet Muhammad is our model, and he obviously destroyed the idols at the Kaaba, and people, his followers throughout the Arabian Peninsula, destroyed a lot of idols, and so iconoclasm is at the heart of Islam, and we're just the purest of all Muslims. But then you have to wonder, why haven't other Muslims done this? For a long time, the Temple of Bel was used as a mosque. There's iconoclasm. Often people think of it being as important to Islam, but if you look at the sort of history of Muslim peoples, these sites have not been destroyed. And I actually sort of looked at some of the Islamic law on this, and one of the sort of ways in which people talk about this is, yes, there is some sense of destroying idols in Islam, but you don't destroy idols if they're not worshipped. So these sites, there's nobody worshipping these sites. So ISIS is taking it to another level. And as we've already suggested here, there's quite a lot of hypocrisy, of course, on the part of ISIS. They are also making a lot of money off the sale of these supposed impure idols, pagan idols. So.
Well, and I think there was also a beheading of someone who was smuggling. There was a sort of a public beheading of a smuggler, but at the same time, of course, there are, that's a media gesture, but of course they have their own smugglers. So.
Aren't they actually taxing the smugglers as well? 20%. 20%? Wow. Should we start taking questions, Jeff? I mean, I could see a couple of questions out there.
Absolutely. Let's open this up to you. Part of the, I think, motivation behind a panel was that it might generate dialogue for anyone interested in attending. So,
and we could just repeat the questions rather than handing the microphone.
Sure, I can do that, I think.
Oh, much more. Okay, so $36 million is what National Geographic reported for one region of Syria last year. So they probably made a great deal more money than that. I mean, am I right about that? I think it's a lot of money, because these are some you know, these are some sweet artifacts,
And-
you know.
And the market, the number one market is Europe.
They still drop in the bucket though, because they made at least $2 billion off oil last year.
But I mean, your question is exactly, yeah. I mean, would we be giving money to ISIS, or at least to, would we be, you know, in doing that? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely. That, I mean, and that's, I mean, and I'm not saying this is a good idea. I'm saying that this is well, Vikan, I should say, this, well, you know, the museum director says it's the least worst alternative among all these terrible alternatives, because otherwise the things are just going to go destroyed, or they're going to go into a market where they're never recoverable. And I know my wife put this well. I don't know if I'm going to be able to put it as well as she did, which was that she opposed this because she said we would be ransoming future pasts for the sake of the present past. And I think she's absolutely right about that. Still, you know, it's funny because you know, the British Museum is probably the worst institution to talk about repatriating things, you know. But it is true that, I mean, this has happened in the past, right? I mean, you know, in Cyprus in the 70s, I mean, you know, there were Christian churches that were being destroyed, and the frescoes were, you know, being bought up by, and they were in Dallas for, I think, 40 years, and then just repatriated a couple of years ago deliberately as part of this policy of repatriating. That is to say, making it safe for the people who live in the area. That's a pretty unique example, I would think. But he's, you know, this article calls for us to behave like that, to make it, you know, to repatriate this cultural heritage to the place that it comes from.
Yes, Matt.
I have no idea, but I do know that, so there is a necropolis on the outskirts of Palmyra, and they've destroyed 7 tombs of the necropolis, but there are still some left. So I would say that that would probably be the next to go. Hopefully the theater in Palmyra, the Roman theater, is one of the best preserved in the world, and they haven't done any destruction there as far as we know, but that might be also on the chopping block.
What about Dora Europos? Is it, you know,
It's been ransacked already. Dora Europos is another site in Syria, and illegal looting there, not wholesale destruction, but if you look at satellite images from 2011 and today, it looks like Swiss cheese because people have just gone out and just done illegal digging. So.
And this is the site of, I think, the earliest synagogue that we know of. The earliest representation of the of like Christ as the Good Shepherd is in Dora Europos, and it's gone. You know, a lot of graffiti. You know.
Yes, Matt.
I do think that's part of it. One of the sort of operational manuals of ISIS is a book that came out, or it's actually a PDF file that was spread on the sort of jihadi internet, if you will, from 2004 called The Management of Savagery. It's by this guy, Abu Bakr al-Naji, I think his name is. That's a pseudonym. It could be a group of people. But the management of savagery is really about, and it's you can find it online. It's translated if you would like to read it. But it basically outlines a sort of policy of sort of terrorizing the local population, with the aim of inviting the United States or others to fight. And it's kind of actually got 3 stages. One is sort of vexation of the enemy, where you actually start to destroy local sites. And that could be cultural sites. I mean, mostly they talk about sort of oil refineries and things like this. And you're actually really there trying to really destroy the capabilities or make chaos for the local government. Then you sort of spread savagery. That's the actual term, the next stage. And there you're really sort of killing a lot of people, basically. Anybody who you recognize as being non-Muslim. And then finally, the administration of savagery. You've created this sort of chaotic place, and then you build your state there. Now, their model for sort of, and this is where a lot of jihadis got a lot of their training, was Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. And actually, one of the funny things that they actually do is they quote Paul Kennedy in their, where he sort of says America's in danger of overextending itself. And so you have them using the Soviet model. We kicked the Soviets out, we overextended them, and then sort of applying it now to the Americans. And they think, the actual, Al-Naji was not saying Syria. He suggested other places like Yemen and Jordan, I think, as well. But Syria certainly, ISIS has sort of seen that as a good, this is their sort of playbook. And one of the ways you can get the West to really pay attention is by attacking these World Heritage Sites, which they feel the West cares a lot about, but but it has no place in sort of their future world. Does that sort of start to answer your question? Maybe not quite the post-colonial aspect, but I do see it as part of this long-term plan to sort of create conditions by which America will be engaged in a sort of warfare. And they really do have a view that somehow, even though they are a lot less powerful, they can drag America into some sort of quagmire that will ultimately, lead perhaps to governments falling and things like this.
I don't know where they would have gotten that idea.
Yeah, Iraq, Afghanistan, other places. So, was there something else sort of, I think the Taliban is related to that, but I tend to think of the Taliban as doing that more because this was a Buddhist site and it was a place where potentially people were worshipping. I don't think ISIS has any concern about these being religious sites. It's the World Heritage angle, and they want to destroy these sites to, one of the things sort of in that first stage of vexing the enemy is to do really grand gestures, things that will draw recruits from the Arab region who say, hey, you're actually doing something against the West or against the Syrian regime, as opposed to say Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda just waits around forever and ever and doesn't seem to be doing anything. You're doing something, big grand gestures all the time, and that's part of the ISIS playbook.
And the manuals are in English.
Well, no, they're translated. They've been but some of them, it's actually translated by McCants. I think he's Virginia Tech or something. Anyway, Does that help?
I think also the way that these have been filmed and broadcast makes it very clear that it's something that the message is being sent to us, and the invitation is for us to engage.
Oh yeah, the video quality of the destruction is, these are very watchable. You're not watching a sort of YouTube clip going, "What's he doing?" It's all highly produced so that you know precisely what it is that. It's a very artistic sort of vandalism.
Yes, Professor Peter.
Was also thinking about the Afghanistan Caliphate connection. Thanks for your clarification of that. Are there any actual statements by ISIS about what they were doing and why they were doing it? Which, of course, would be false. But I've just been looking through the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times here to see what the reports are. It all seems, in terms of motivation, reports on motivation, highly speculative. But I don't know. I wondered if there's actually, you wouldn't trust their statement necessarily, but it might be interesting.
What is it?
What their frame was. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if they've made a formal declaration, and I think they actually haven't publicized these destructions as compared to, say, the Mosul Museum, where they went in and made these highly choreographed. They have guys with, sledgehammers in slow motion, sort of destroying things. It's like very Hollywood production.
Cutting on
It's
motion.
not Michael Bay quite yet, but but they are. But they haven't they haven't publicized this as much. I mean, we have sort of satellite imagery, right, of sort of the temple before and after.
We have a ground level high def
yeah.
video.
Okay, there is a high. Yes, sorry, there is. I mean, their argument has been, what I've seen is sort of a typical sort of Islamic argument, or what they see as a typical Islamic argument. But I would suggest that that really doesn't apply. Most Muslims are horrified by, almost all Muslims are horrified by this and don't think it really has anything to do with Islamic law. This is sort of their sort of particular vision.
And maybe it's worth articulating that the typical jihadi or Islamist argument about the destruction of these sites is that they're a location for shirk, which is enjoining things to God that are not part of God. So when you treat a statue as if it's a god, or you bring it offerings, or you think that it can intercede for you, one of the very important parts of Muhammad's prophethood was working to undermine the sort of the political and economic system that was based on the belief that bringing offerings to these idols could have some kind of impact on your life. So again, when they talk about unity or tawheed, they're talking about the belief that God is one. He doesn't take forms of statues or of people, and so to worship those things is forbidden.
And how might this fit into the notion of a caliphate? I mean, what is the relationship between?
The word caliph actually comes from the Arabic khalifa, which means someone who is a representative or who stands in the place of. And originally, the khalifa was the person who was the representative of Muhammad after he had passed away. Eventually, it became Khalifat Allah, which means the person who stands in the place of God, but that's a later development. First, it was just the successor to the prophet. So the caliphate is actually the person who is either the successor to the prophet and his the political entity that was created for Muslims, or the person who is the representative of God on earth. So.
And the formal caliphate sort of ended in 1924 with the the Turkish government just basically voting it out of existence, which shows the power of the modern state, right?
Right, and my question is based upon some of the rhetoric of ISIS about establishing a new, administration of the region. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think ISIS is sort of different from a lot of jihadi groups in that they have really tried to create a state and seen the administration of territory as being very important. I mean, Al-Qaeda obviously was on the run. It was sort of hiding in a sense and was not really building a state and providing social services. As I mentioned, that sort of three-stage process, the last one, this kind of management of savagery, this sort of that when you have this state, this chaotic state, out of that you build, it's called the administration of savagery. You put in your own sort of social welfare state, you build in your own community with its own moral values. And I think that is really the stage that they proclaimed when, I think it was June 29th of 2014, when this man, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was proclaimed the caliph. So in a sense it was a statement that we are here and Muslims should rally to us. And it's kind of unclear. I think Boko Haram have sort of recognized him as a caliph, but no others in the Muslim world have. So.
The administration of savagery has also carried over to the archaeological side. They have a department of archaeology, which is just kind of infuriating since they're not doing archaeology. And they are supposed to manage who's digging. You have to report what you're digging, and they tax it. And their rhetoric, at least, is that if you dig up people, they have to be destroyed, so any artifacts showing people. Now, a lot of the objects that have been recovered from Syria already do have people, so I'm not sure if they slip through the cracks or if ISIS is saying they're going to be destroyed but are not destroying them. It's unclear to me. But they have even administered to archaeology in the savagery, I guess.
Other questions? Yes, in the back.
That is a really quite a great question, I think, and I don't think if we know, because I think a lot of people thought immediately they would start destroying stuff, and that they didn't probably speaks to the fact that they were interested in some of this for selling the artifacts, right? And maybe they were hoping to do it silently. But yeah, there's probably something to that. I don't know the sort of rate of the advance of the Syrian army right now. I haven't actually seen that, but and I haven't read this article, but that's actually a pretty interesting sort of thing to think about, is why now after so many months? And I think that sounds that's persuasive to me, that maybe it's sort of the time when, now and ever.
Yes.
So you mentioned as a possible safety precaution museums buying up artifacts and things of that nature. What could you do for locations like the temples that are blown up? What can you do to secure those areas and be safe, if any?
Not a lot,
Yeah.
obviously. They have to be guarded, and that has been impossible in the current system. And it's impossible for a lot of sites. So a lot of sites are currently unguarded and have been looted throughout that area of the world and even in America. So it is very difficult with a site that size to secure it and prevent looters and prevent destruction.
You really do have to have a sort of cultural agreement that the site is important. I mean, you could be walking around in Pompeii, as we have done, and, if you turn a corner and you feel like carving your name into something and creating a little modern graffiti, there's nobody to stop you. You just have to agree that when you go into the place, that's just not the sort of thing you're going to do. That's not a very satisfactory answer. I would love that we had a shield that went over.
Big bubble.
Well, I think it goes to the World Heritage Sites international treaty. I mean, I think that ISIS is, and this is something that came up in our discussions before we decided to have a public panel, was that the idea of the World Heritage Site is based on trust. It's based on international agreement, and ISIS chose a World Heritage Site, essentially saying that those rules don't apply to us. And so I think that that would stretch across the ancient world, across archaeological sites as well. Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and I think it also goes back to what I think Matt was alluding to, which is it's this statement of we don't respect this authority. We're not beholden to this authority. We're beholden to a higher authority, and no one can stop us.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, because of course, ISIS didn't invent iconoclasm or despoiling things. I mean, one of the most famous monuments in Rome is the Arch of Titus, on which is depicted, the triumphal parade in which the menorah from the temple is being carried. So here you have this ancient monument that has on it the representation of the despoiling of another ancient monument, the point of which is to say, we have your thing. The thing that you think is so very valuable, we now have it. And, in fact, we've had a parade, and now the parade is part of the monument,
But in that example, the Romans are treasuring that menorah. They see the power of it, and ISIS instead has destroyed it. Your thing, it's gone.
Yeah, okay, so maybe I'm being postmodern here, but I think that the film of the destruction of the thing is the monument, is the work of art that has been created.
Arch of Titus.
Yeah, I mean,
YouTube.
I actually have a question for the. Am I allowed to ask a question too?
Please ask. Yes.
For the archaeologist. In another conversation I had about this, it was brought up that the Parthenon was also destroyed by the Venetians, I think in the end of the 19th century. No. That's right. So, and then it was rebuilt. And I was just wondering, is there a possibility of rebuilding this someday? Or, of reconstructing it from what's left? Or do you have a sense from the pictures?
I haven't seen enough evidence to say how much is actually going to be there. And I don't know that people would choose to do that or not. They certainly could. I don't know I don't know. What do you think the climate is?
I don't know. I mean, you know, with the Parthenon, of course, there's an awful lot of it, but I mean, I think Mary Beard, the classicist, says the Parthenon is really not a reconstruction so much as a plausible, you know, possibility, you know, that maybe it looked like this, you know, this column may have gone here, and this piece might have gone here. You know, to answer the question you had before, I mean, it is possible to take entire temples out of their sites, like in Germany, yeah, Pergamum. You know, the entire Temple of Pergamum is in Berlin, and Luxor is in New York. You know, but nobody thinks of that as being a good thing. Everybody thinks that there's something wrong with. Well, I shouldn't say everybody.
Unsettling.
It's unsettling. It's very well put. You know, you've dealt with this before. You know.
Well, I would just like to propose that another possible way to orient ourselves to this thing that's happened and to the possible future destruction of places is to think about the possibility that these sites aren't victims, casualties of the war, but they're more like refugees, and there's the possibility that at some future time they can be brought back as part of our, sort of brought back to these communities and the places where they stood.
And there's an initiative happening right now to do 3D modeling of as many sites as they can in that area. So at least we'll have a digital record of what was there.
You know, that's an excellent question that Nick wants to answer, I can tell.
I don't know if it's, probably an ethical thing, but it's also going to makes a lot of jobs for some people, right? So I'm sure this might be good for archaeologists in some way, a sad way. I was sort of joking about it earlier. No, it's not good news, but it's, no, I think there's work to be done, I would say.
Well, and this is very much in line with that the article that you shared with us last week, where the response
Yes,
to this
that's
can
right.
also be to make enormous investments in preserving the treasures that we have.
Yeah, it was the archaeologist at Cornell, and she made the argument that for us as archaeologists, what we should be doing is really highlighting the great work we actually do to already preserve sites. Maybe not this particular site, but this is a moment in which we can, through this destruction, show actually how important it is to preserve things. And I don't think the public knows, I guess it's a Joni Mitchell song, right? You don't know what you got until it's gone. So, I don't know why that popped in. But, I think that was the sort of, instead of concentrating only on the destruction, which plays into the hands of ISIS, we should be thinking about preserving more of these remains.
And this is also a moment to mention the fact that these places, and many places that are not vulnerable because of political conflicts, for a long time they've been vulnerable just because of the kind of resources that are available to take care of them, or because there are many artifacts that are vulnerable because of pollution or other kinds of human activities that could be. So that's a place where we can invest in things that we do have the possibility.
You know, it's interesting too, because I mean, I'm a classicist, so of course I think that the Greco-Roman stuff, yes, we have absolutely have an ethical obligation, but you can drive, in different parts of Tennessee, up the Tellico Dam, and you're driving over that lake, and they flooded the Cherokee homeland there. There's all sorts of stuff down there, and there was no reason to really build the lake that didn't have to happen. And the archaeologists who worked at University of Tennessee who work on Cherokee stuff said this is an atrocity, but that nobody felt any ethical obligation to that particular ancient civilization. But it's funny, like the same argument we were making before, that if you care about the antiquities, you don't care about the people, or if you care about these antiquities, you don't care about those antiquities. I mean, this is a false dichotomy. In some ways, it seems to me like it's just an expression of the despair we feel about what to do about ISIS and about the things in this part of the world, that we set up these false dichotomies and feel that they have any validity, that,
Well, and I think a slightly less generous reading, also, although I don't disagree with that one, is that there's also something about looking down on people and cultures that do not appear to value or are incapable or unwilling to protect antiquities that makes us feel more civilized. And to go back again to Edward Said, but there's a certain way in which we construct ourselves as civilized by being horrified by the destruction of these things. And I think there are probably people who participate in being horrified by the destruction of these things that perhaps didn't know that they existed before. But so there's also that aspect.
Oh yeah, there was this really pedantic piece by Mary Beard in the London Review of Books in which she said, she was really irritated that everybody kept talking about the amphitheater at Palmyra, and she says, "There's no amphitheater at Palmyra. There's a theater at Palmyra. People are really, an amphitheater is oval, and a theater is half, and she said, if they don't even know what the cultural heritage is that they want to see preserved, they're just as bad as ISIS." And it's clearly overstated.
Wow. On that note, I think we have about time for 2 more questions. Yes, in the front.
Well, about preserving those sites, those historical sites, the ones that you cannot move easily outside. Well, preserving them at where they are, I think it's a possibility. They're shielding them. As you know, there are several sites that ISIS dreams about destroying every night. Karbala, they would love to destroy that. That's the sign that would send out to all the to Shia countries that we did this. And also the Zainab in Syria, they would love to destroy that too. But local people, as well as some minor military help from neighbors, they have been able to preserve those. And as far as I know, not even a bullet has been shot over those places. So I think if local people want to preserve those sites, with minimal support from outside, they are able to do that. But I'm afraid there is not that much will and desire in local people, at least in that region, to preserve those sites, or maybe not as much as many people here in the West care about them. Nothing to the Middle East or Syria people care about those sites.
I don't know, when they beheaded Khalid al-Assad, the 82-year-old archaeologist, I think everybody understood that the protecting of the sites was just not going to be much of an option. They were in control of the site. That was a savage act and a highly symbolic one. They hung him, after they beheaded him.
I think Amir has a good. I think you have a good point, though. The Islamic sites are getting protected in the region, and Palmyra, I think, also is pretty isolated from other big cities in Syria. It's kind of off on its own, so it may have made it difficult to sort of protect in the same way that Kabbala, for instance, it's in the middle of everything. Anyway, so I think, it's an interesting point that there is a level of protection, but maybe not for these sites. Possibly geography, probably has more to do with Islamic history.
Yes.
I may have missed some of what you were saying about this, but could you articulate the moral principle underlying the argument for the usually ethicists are worried about that in terms of weighing things as well. It's like if we had finite limited resources, we could protect 100,000 people or protect the site.
Yeah, and that's not really a theoretical argument if we're talking about funding ISIS, right? That we pay. Yeah.
I don't know. Leon Wieseltier had a great piece in the Atlantic just a few days ago in which he did make that case. I think he said, you take somebody like Khalid al-Assad who died to protect buildings, the faiths of which he did not share. This is a tremendous act of humanism. This is a martyr not for his own faith, but for the, to preserve the remnants of the faiths of others. To my mind, that is a moral principle. I mean, I can see that as a moral principle.
I guess I would add that I think that the two have to go hand in hand, that in protecting the people, we have a responsibility to protect their history and their culture. So our moral obligation to, I'm not saying America needs to get involved, but the responsibility to protect the people carries on further than that and into their culture and history.
Wow, that brings us all the way back around to where we began. So I think that's an excellent stopping point. Please join me in thanking our panelists this evening. And thanking yourselves. Thanks for coming out to engage with current events. It's gratifying. Thank you.